Welcome back to Dark Domain, where the line between reality and fear blurs a little more with each story. Tonight we're venturing into the unknown, dark waters, shadowy figures, and voices that call from places you should never go. These are the kinds of stories that creep in slowly, leaving you questioning every sound, every shadow, long after the tale has ended. Before we dive in, let me know what time it is where you're listening from, whether it's the dead of night or the break of dawn. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Dark Domain if you dare, because once you step into the dark, there's no turning back. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unsettling. Just remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Silent Boat. My dad and Uncle Jack used to go deep-sea fishing off the coast of Maine every summer. They were seasoned fishermen, having done this for years, always taking Jack's old 30-foot cabin cruiser out at least 20 miles off the coast where the big fish were. They had their routine: leave before sunrise, stay out all day, and sometimes even spend the night on the water. But there was one trip they never forgot. It was the summer of 1985, and they had headed out farther than usual, about 25 miles offshore. The sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and purples, and they had the radio on low, sipping beers as they waited for a bite. What they didn't know was that this trip would leave them with something far worse than just a bad memory. That night, the weather turned unexpectedly. A thick fog rolled in from nowhere, covering the ocean in a blanket of mist. The wind had died down, leaving everything unnervingly still. My dad said it felt like the world had just stopped. By 10 p.m., the fog was so thick they could barely see past the bow of the boat. Jack decided to drop anchor, thinking it would be safer to wait until morning. My dad agreed, and they settled in the cabin, playing cards to pass the time. The fog pressed in around them, making everything outside the windows look like a wall of white. Just after midnight, they heard it, a faint, low humming sound. It was hard to pinpoint where it was coming from at first. They assumed it was the wind, or maybe the current hitting the boat in a strange way. But the sound grew louder, and it wasn't just the wind. It sounded human. The two of them stepped out onto the deck, shining their flashlights into the mist. The beam of light barely cut through the fog, and they couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. But the humming sound was unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from behind the boat. "Do you hear that?" my dad asked. Jack nodded, his face pale. "Sounds like someone humming." The thought made my dad shudder. There was no reason anyone else should have been out there, this far from shore, and yet the sound grew louder. They stood there, frozen, listening as the humming circled their boat, echoing across the water. Then, out of nowhere, they saw it, a shadow barely visible through the fog. A boat, maybe 40 feet away, silently drifting toward them. It wasn't like any boat they had seen before. It looked old, like something from another era, with its hull low in the water and no visible lights. There was no sound of an engine, no splashing from oars or movement of any kind. Just the boat, moving closer, gliding soundlessly through the fog. Jack grabbed the spotlight from the cabin and shone it toward the boat. The beam cut through the mist, revealing more details. The boat was covered in algae and barnacles like it had been adrift for years. And then they saw the figures. Standing on the deck were two people, a man and a woman, both wearing old, tattered clothes. Their faces were pale, almost gaunt, and they were staring straight at my dad and Jack. But what unnerved them the most wasn't the figures. It was that their mouths were open, moving, but no sound was coming out. The humming wasn't coming from them. Jack dropped the spotlight, cursing under his breath. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. The two figures didn't move. They just stood there, mouths moving silently, as the boat drifted closer and closer. My dad felt his heart pounding in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Without saying a word, Jack ran back into the cabin, grabbing the keys and fumbling to start the engine. "We're getting out of here," he muttered, his voice shaking. But just as the engine sputtered to life, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. My dad covered his ears, looking around frantically, trying to see where it was coming from. It wasn't the figures on the boat. It was something else. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the strange boat vanished into the fog. Jack slammed the throttle forward and they sped off, cutting through the water as fast as the boat could go. They didn't look back, didn't say a word. The only sound was the roar of the engine and the splashing of the water against the hull. But even with the engine roaring, my dad swore he could still hear the humming, faint but constant, following them. They made it back to shore just after sunrise, both of them shaken and pale. Neither of them spoke about what had happened on the water for weeks. They tried to convince themselves it was just the fog, their minds playing tricks on them. But deep down, they knew better. My dad couldn't shake the feeling that they had seen something they weren't supposed to. And Jack, well, he never took that boat out again. It sat at the dock, slowly rotting away, until he finally sold it years later. To this day, whenever my dad tells the story, his hands still tremble. He says he doesn't believe in ghosts, but something was out there that night. Something that didn't belong. And every time he hears the low hum of a motor or the distant sound of water lapping against a boat, it takes him right back to that night, when the ocean wasn't empty after all. The Man in the Canal. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, and like most people in South Florida, my family lived on the water. We had a nice house in a gated community, right on a private canal that led out to the ocean. My dad's boat was his pride and joy, and my sister Rachel and I had grown up spending most weekends out on the water. But last summer, something happened that changed how I feel about the water. I don't think I'll ever be able to look at the canal the same way again. It was a hot, sticky day in July, and Rachel and I decided to take the jet skis out for a ride. Our parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us at home. We rode out of the canal into the bay and spent the day cruising, jumping waves and exploring little coves along the shoreline. Around mid-afternoon, as we were floating in the bay, catching our breath from a long ride, a man on a boat pulled up next to us. He was in his 50s, with a gut and a beer in his hand, wearing an old t-shirt and sunglasses that covered most of his face. He smiled at us, a little too widely, and waved. "Nice jet skis you got there," he said, his voice slurred like he'd had a few too many drinks. "Thanks," I said, not really interested in making conversation. Rachel was already starting her engine, sensing the same vibe I was getting. This guy was off. He leaned forward on the rail of his boat, still grinning. "You girls live around here?" "Yeah," Rachel said quickly. "We should get going. Have a good day." But as she turned her jet ski, the man raised his voice. "You know, I've got a pool back at my house. You could come by? Have a drink." My stomach twisted. There was something about the way he said it, something oily and dark. "No thanks, we're heading home," I said firmly, starting my own engine. The man didn't argue, he just stared at us as we sped off, his creepy smile fading as we left him behind. We didn't think much of it at first. Creeps on the water aren't exactly uncommon, and we figured that was the end of it. But when we reached the canal and began idling back toward our house, something caught my eye. A boat, his boat, was drifting behind us. Rachel noticed it too. "Is that him?" she asked, her voice tense. I glanced back, and sure enough, it was the same man following us at a distance. He wasn't speeding, just drifting, like he wanted us to know he was there. "He's following us," I muttered, my heart pounding. Rachel and I sped up, taking the last few turns in the canal quickly. We docked the jet skis at our house, hurriedly tying them up, and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. We didn't see the boat pass by, but we knew he'd seen where we lived. That night, long after the sun had set, I was in my room getting ready for bed when our dog, Max, started barking like crazy downstairs. I rushed down to quiet him, thinking maybe it was a raccoon or some neighborhood cat. But when I got to the living room, I froze. There, through the large glass doors that looked out onto the canal, I saw him, the man. He was standing in our yard near the water's edge, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My heart dropped into my stomach. He was just watching. I backed away slowly, not wanting him to see me. I grabbed my phone and ran upstairs to Rachel's room, bursting through the door. "Rachel, he's outside," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, confused. "Who?" "The guy from the boat. He's in the yard." Rachel jumped up, her face pale. We both peeked out her bedroom window, which overlooked the yard and the canal. He was still there, standing by the dock, motionless. But this time, he had something in his hand, a long metal pole or pipe. "We need to call the police," Rachel said, her voice trembling. I dialed 911, trying to explain what was happening while keeping an eye on the man. But as I spoke to the operator, something strange happened. He began moving toward the boat. Not walking, but almost jogging like he had just decided to leave. Within moments, he was climbing into the boat, untying it from the dock. By the time the police arrived, he was gone, disappeared into the dark water of the canal. The police searched the area but found nothing. They told us to lock all the doors and windows, stay inside, and call them if he returned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next night, we made sure everything was locked up tight before going to bed. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise, a thud, then another. I sat up in bed listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like it was coming from outside, near the dock. I crept out of my room and down the hall, peeking out the window overlooking the backyard. The moon was bright that night, casting just enough light on the canal to see clearly. There on the dock, I saw the man again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, holding another long metal pole, was a second man, just as tall, just as unsettling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They were looking at the house, their eyes scanning the windows, almost like they were searching for something, or someone. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. They weren't just stalking us. They were planning something. I ran to Rachel's room and shook her awake. "They're back," I whispered, my voice shaking. "There's 2 of them now." She bolted upright, grabbing her phone and dialing 911 again. But as she did, we heard it. The back door sliding open downstairs. They were inside. We locked ourselves in Rachel's room, huddled in the corner with Max, praying the police would get there in time. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder, closer. I could hear the men whispering to each other, their voices low and sinister. Then suddenly, everything went silent. We sat there holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed like hours, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The footsteps retreated. The men were gone. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found nothing. The men had vanished again, leaving no trace behind. We told the officers everything, the man, the boat, the strange second figure, but they had no leads. And just like that, the terror was over. At least for that night. We haven't seen him since, but I know he's still out there. Every time I look out at the canal, I half expect to see that boat drifting by. The 2 men standing silently on the deck, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if the police hadn't shown up in time? The voice on the water. It was a perfect summer night, the kind where the air is warm and everything feels calm. My friend Jason had just gotten his new 30-foot houseboat, and we spent the day drifting on Lake Champlain, drinking and enjoying the breeze. There were 5 of us, me, Jason, his girlfriend Maya, and 2 of our friends, Derek and Emily. We anchored near a small, uninhabited island as the sun began to set. It was quiet, peaceful. The last thing we expected was to hear a scream. We were all sitting around, the boat gently bobbing in the water. Jason had some music playing, low and steady, as the stars started to appear in the sky. We weren't far from the shore of the island, just close enough to admire the tree line where the woods met the rocky beach. I thought maybe it was just a bird or the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, but then it came again, louder this time. A scream. Someone was screaming for help. "Turn the music off," I said, sitting up, my skin prickling with unease. "Did you hear that?" Jason paused the music, and the five of us sat in silence, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the gentle sound of the water slapping against the side of the boat. Then it came again. A woman's voice, distant but unmistakable, crying out into the night. "Help, please, help me." The voice came from the island. We all looked toward the shore, where the dark outline of the trees loomed like shadows. I could see movement, just a flicker of something near the edge of the woods. It was so brief, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. "We should check it out," Derek said, already standing up. Jason nodded, his face serious. "Yeah, let's go." We pulled up the anchor, and Jason slowly steered the boat toward the shore. The engine hummed softly, but the atmosphere had changed. The calm from earlier was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The scream came again, louder this time, more desperate. We reached the island and hopped out of the boat, flashlights in hand. The air was cooler here, and the trees seemed to press in around us, as if the island itself was watching. The only light came from our beams as we swept them over the rocks and bushes. "Where are you?" Maya called out, her voice trembling. For a moment there was silence. Then, from deeper in the woods, we heard it again. "Help me. They're following me." Something about the way she said it made my blood run cold. The voice was frantic, panicked, but there was something off about it. It sounded too mechanical, too perfect, like it was being played from a recording. Jason looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. We pushed forward into the trees, calling out for the woman, but the deeper we went, the darker and more oppressive the island became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The scream came again, but it was harder to pinpoint now, echoing through the trees like it was bouncing off every surface. "There!" Emily said, shining her light ahead. "I think I see her." I followed her beam and saw a flash of white through the trees. We ran toward it, hearts pounding, but when we reached the spot, all we found was an old tattered piece of fabric, caught on a branch swaying in the breeze. No sign of the woman. "What the hell?" Jason muttered. "Where is she?" And then, as if in answer, the scream came again, this time from behind us. I whipped around, shining my flashlight back toward the shore, but there was no one. Just the dark shape of the boat in the distance. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This doesn't make any sense. Suddenly, Derek's voice broke through the tension. "Guys, look at this." He was standing near a fallen tree, pointing at something on the ground. We all hurried over, our flashlights converging on the same spot. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small speaker, crackling and playing the same desperate scream, looping over and over. "Help me, please help me." "What the—" Emily started, but her voice trailed off, the realization hitting us all at once. This had been a setup. Someone had placed the speaker here. But why? Before any of us could process what was happening, we heard something else. The sound of a motor, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the water. Jason ran toward the shore with the rest of us close behind. When we broke through the tree line, we saw it. A boat, larger than Jason's, drifting away from the island with its lights off. It was barely visible in the dark, but we could see the faint outline as it moved farther into the lake. "Was that boat here when we got to the island?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No," Jason said, his face pale. "It wasn't." Panic set in. Someone had lured us to this island. Someone was watching us. "Let's get out of here," Jason said, his voice tight. We scrambled back onto the boat, hands shaking as we untied it from the shore. Jason fired up the engine and we sped away from the island, the boat bouncing over the waves as we cut through the water. But the entire time I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing back at the dark island, expecting to see something, or someone, standing on the shore, watching us leave. As we reached the middle of the lake, Jason slowed the boat down, his face grim. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. No one had an answer. We sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. I could still hear the woman's scream in my head, looping over and over. When we finally got back to the marina, we reported what had happened to the authorities. They took our statements, but nothing ever came of it. No one was missing, no strange boats were reported, and no one could explain the speaker on the island. But that night haunted me. Someone had lured us there. Someone had set up the scream to draw us in, and I couldn't stop wondering, what would have happened if we hadn't found the speaker? If we had stayed on the island just a little longer? You've made it through another journey into the unknown, but don't get too comfortable. The shadows might seem quiet for now, but in the world of dark domain, they're always watching. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And remember, in the dark, nothing is ever truly over. Until next time, keep your lights low, your doors locked, and your eyes open. You never know what's lurking just out of sight.